Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Man in America. I'm your host, Seth Holhouse. So you probably heard the saying, history repeats itself. And as we look around in modern America, what history are we repeating? So a lot of folks have often talked about the similarities between modern America and ancient Rome and the fall of Rome. And there's a lot of elements to what caused Rome to fall that you can see playing out right here in America. Unfettered immigration was a big one to say, okay, hey, come one, come all, we'll see what happens. The debasing of currency, inflation, etc. So joining us today is my good friend, Jeremy Slate, who is a fellow podcaster, but also someone who did his master's in literally Rome and the collapse of Rome. So we're going to be talking about what happened in ancient Rome. How does it relate to what's happening now? How can looking at what happened, hundreds and hundreds of years ago in ancient Rome help us to understand what's happening in America and what could come next? So, folks, please enjoy the interview with Jeremy Slate. Jeremy, you've had me on your show, but it's great to finally get you as a guest on my show. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Seth, I really appreciate you having me on, man. I've been watching you way back since, really you started online. So I just appreciate you having me, man.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we've met a handful of times at the Clay Clark's conferences, and it's just nice to speak to people that are on the same wavelength, from many different areas. And so today, our topic is the fall of Rome and the parallels between the fall of Rome and what we're seeing in America today. And you're someone that's I think plays an interesting role in this because if I'm not mistaken, you studied extensively in your formal education the Roman Empire and the fall of Rome. Is that right?
So my master's degree is actually in the propaganda that was the transition from the Republic to the Empire, of like the tools that Augustus used to convince people he was God. Then after graduating, I did a lot more, research into the fall, reading Edward Gibbon, things like that. So I have, I guess, a lot more familiarity than your regular person, but I wouldn't say like I'm a PhD in the subject.
Okay, only a master's degree, not a PhD. So we'll take it. Well, what's interesting?
Well, historians are funny, man, because it's like
you're right.
Historians are we're really good at making you think our opinion is actually what happened. So that's just one thing you got to think about with us history people.
That's a good point. But I think what makes you kind of uniquely positioned is that I feel like from watching your shows and talking to you, you have a pretty accurate understanding of what's happening in the world today. You understand that there are powerful forces that are controlling this world, that these powerful forces were also in many ways in power during the Roman Empire, and that there's these lineages that they've maintained. And you understand that there's certain playbooks that they've used throughout history to collapse nations and everything. And talking at where America's at today, if I brought on someone that was, say, a professor, say it was a liberal professor, they'd have a really hard time kind of correlating Rome to America today, because they'd be saying, "Oh, open borders are good," but anyone knows what open borders and kind of free immigration did to Rome. So I'm looking forward to this. So let's just go ahead and start with, because there's so many things we could talk about as it relates to Roman America. But what in the collapse of the Roman Empire, what would you say were some of the defining reasons that led to this collapse of this empire that during the time people probably thought would last forever, but of course it never happens?
So I think when you look at it, you have to get your terms correct as well. So Rome was originally founded in 753 BC, and you have kind of this era of kings. Then you have the Republic, which is 509 to 31, and then in 31 BC is when you really have where the Roman Empire starts, and that's with Augustus. And you have this time period of an empire that lasts really from 31 to 476 AD. So that's 500 years of empire. Now, in the East, the Byzantines, they would have thought they were Romans as well, right? Because they wouldn't have considered themselves Byzantines. So if you ask them, the Roman Empire ended in 1453. So there's kind of these different discussions of when did it actually end. But if we're looking at the West, Western power really fell in 476 when Rome fell to the barbarians at that point in time. So when you're looking at that, there's a lot of different causes, right? I think it's hard to say that there's one cause that did it, but one major problem that pops up in the 3rd century is Roman emperors realized that their power comes from the military. And because of that, under the Severan emperors in the 3rd century, they double the size of the military. And they then take different metals and mix them with the money and they debase the currency. And by the late 3rd century, you have the currency is about a 15,000% inflation. So inflation is out of control. You've also, for hundreds of years, had barbarian tribes that are, on the peripheries of Rome. And in 212, you have Emperor Caracalla issues the Edict of Caracalla, where he takes all of the people living in the Roman provinces and says, hey, guess what? You guys are citizens now too. And there's different thought processes on why he did this. One is because the Roman Empire could then tax their inheritance. So, it was basically a money thing. But you have all these new people that now were able to get the grain dole from Rome. So they were able to get food and things like that. And they're within the empire and they're being funded by the empire. So you have immigration as another big problem. Then you also have crumbling central power, because after Marcus Aurelius, funny enough, he's the Roman emperor. Everybody's like, oh, he was, such a wonderful thinker and he had all these great ideas. But he changes how the next emperor is named by naming his son Commodus, who was totally incapable of actually ruling the empire. And that crumbles central power for the next 200 years. So you have crumbling central power, you have inflation out of control, and you have immigration. And if you look at what we're experiencing now, Seth, those are the very similar things to what we're experiencing now. I wouldn't say they're on the same level, but they're very similar to what America is experiencing right now.
Would you say that what we're experiencing here in America, which I think that it's easy if you not have this conversation, say, yeah, it's intentional. Some people they might say, well, it's accidental, it's poor leadership. But I think that for people that really know what's happening, you can see that it's as intentional as the towers falling, right? It's like this is a planned collapse. But would you say, when you look at what's happening in America, especially look at the border, immigration, also the money printing, inflation, do you see any signs or indicators that the playbook that is being used on America was heavily based on Rome? Are you seeing that when you look at something happening and saying, like that came from somewhere? What are your thoughts on that?
So I don't necessarily know if the playbook comes from Rome, but I think it's very similar causes, right? Like if you look at politicians throughout history make a lot of the same dumb moves. And I think when you look at the late 3rd century in Rome, you have Emperor Diocletian that tries to save it, and he puts a lot of the right reforms in place, and then just bad leadership kind of continues it. But if you look at what's happening here, I think this is more of like a globalist control play. Because if you look at it, America is kind of, I guess, the last bastion of freedom in the world. And if you take down America, it's going to become much easier for places like the World Economic Forum and things to be able to put through a lot of the ideas they want. So why I don't necessarily think it's a playbook, I think they understand their history. They understand what's worked. And if you look, a couple different immigration is an interesting one, because it causes a couple different problems. Like the first one that it causes is, number one, it overwhelms the welfare state because we now have all these people we have to pay for. But another big thing that no one is talking about is they say, well, what if these illegals, I guess they're calling them newcomers now, or whatever the verbiage is at the moment, what if they get the right to vote? And the thing is, Seth, that doesn't actually matter, because under Obama, the census changed on how congressional representation is put together. So now those illegals are actually counted as part of congressional representation. So I believe California it's anywhere from 5 to 7 seats in Congress that it shouldn't actually have. So all they have to do is, in these different states, change congressional representation, and you've now changed the government. So that's a really big issue with immigration that nobody's really talking about. And I think if you look at it, one of the number one ways Rome fell is there were no Romans left, right? Like it was all these other people that came into it. And that was how they were able to kind of change the empire. And it eventually becomes, the final Roman, I guess, emperor falls in 476, and you have the barbarian king just says, hey, I'm the king now. And that's Odoacer is his name. So we have a similar experience of where the Democrats look at this and they say, well, if we can change the voting populace, if we can change the voting base, well, we become the power in the state. And the money is kind of an interesting one, because if you look at the inflation, I think it's our politicians have too much faith in themselves, and I think they can keep it going forever. But I think groups like the World Economic Forum want that to happen because they don't want the dollar to have primacy anymore. Because if it does, it's much easier to control us just like they control other countries.
That makes sense. And so with immigration, you have everyone coming in, and it's okay. We talk about America being the melting pot. It's like, okay, that's true, and there's good aspects to that. Like my family traces back to Germany and Ireland and Scotland and England, and obviously, I'm not a Native American, right? I don't have multi generations here that were living off the land, so there's good in that. But in America right now, even though it seems somewhat turbulent looking around, this is actually a really peaceful time. There's no civil
Sure.
war. I mean, yes, we have violence in places like Chicago or in the inner city areas, or there's some bad things, but overall, America is like it's a dream to live here. I can go get in my car and go to the store and buy something and go to the bank and not be robbed or mugged or anything like that. And that's the case for most places in America. But what happens when there is turbulence? What happens when the stability of a country starts to really unravel? You look at Haiti as an example. How quickly it's now descended into this place. They've literally got cannibal gangs roaming around killing people. That's what happens. And so in America, we brought in all these immigrants. We now know that through a lot of reporting, folks like Ann Vandersteen or Michael Jan, that a lot of people coming over the border are military aged men, people that are probably coming in with the intention to cause chaos at some point whenever they get their order. So all of these different tribes that we've brought into this country, right? And I think tribes is a relatively appropriate way to refer to it. You have these, there's a Somali tribe in this area. There's the Iranian tribe in this area. Like, there's different groupings, but they have their own customs. Right now, during peaceful times, it's easy to adhere to the norms of the United States, our culture. So when things get upset and when the stability of our society really starts to fall apart, what happens to these tribes and what happened in Rome? Right? 'Cause I know Rome, they brought a lot of little tribes into Rome, gave them citizenship. As things started to fall apart, what happened in Rome and how can we use that to understand what might happen here in America?
Well, I think first of all, understanding citizenship is Rome in Rome is kind of an important aspect to that because, as we mentioned, 212, the Edict of Caracalla, anybody in so you have Rome in the center, and anything around Rome is considered the provinces. So Emperor Caracalla says every one of the provinces is now a citizen. Before that, the pathway to citizenship was different. You had Roman citizens that were either born that way or they gained their freedom as maybe they were born a slave or something like that. But you had these tribes that would serve in the Roman military. So you had the regular Roman military, and you had what was called the auxiliary. And you would serve in the auxiliary if you were, one of the barbarian tribes, and you would serve for maybe 20 or 30 years. And after that point, you would be a citizen, and your family would be citizens. Your wife, your kids, everybody would be a citizen at that point. They would gain Roman citizenship. Now that means you can vote. That means you can participate in government. It also means you have access to, any of the welfare state things, such as the grain dole and things like that. So I think it's important to have that understanding to understand, like, what do they plan to do with these military age males that are coming through? And I think the interesting thing to look at, and this goes right back to where Roman emperors realized their power came from, is they realized their power came from the military. I think what you're going to see is you're going to see our government propose the idea, well, you want to be a citizen, how about you serve in our military? Because then they have the loyalty to the person that is giving them the stuff or the citizenship or whatever it be, just like the Roman military had loyalty to whoever was paying them. And that's why they would, raise the military pay 30%, 60%, whatever it may be. That will be my real concern, Seth, because if you look at what happened through the pandemic, we took out a lot of people in the military that were, very good, faithful Americans. Then you have a lot of the woke stuff coming in, and that's changing the military. Now, if you bring in, these new immigrants or illegal immigrants into the military, like you've totally changed the face of the military, and they're not culturally Americans, and they don't have, I guess, uh, faith or something to what it is to be American. You know what I mean? They don't have that willingness to stand up for that. They're willing to stand for whoever gives them the stuff. And I think that is the dangerous thing. And that's one of the major things that causes the downfall of the empire, because You'd have each general raise an army and attack Rome and say, I'm in charge. And in the 3rd century, you had 47 different people claim to be Roman emperor.
Folks, perhaps you'd agree with me when I say that over the past 5 years, the mainstream healthcare system's credibility has plummeted. Alternative healthcare systems that aren't beholden to medical consensus or big pharma are on the rise. Sweetamine is time tested and proven to boost your life with better health. It's one of the leading products that helps with inflammation and daily aches and pains. Just because you get older, it doesn't mean that you have to feel old. And folks, did you know that most of the diseases that make people sick and die these days are rooted in chronic inflammation, oftentimes due to glycine deficiency? So, sweetamine is composed mainly of the amino acid glycine, the nutrient that the immune system uses to regulate inflammation. So, with once daily sweetamine, most people feel the reduction in pain after just a few days. So, I challenge you to the 12-day sweetamine challenge to fight inflammation and take control of your health today. So, folks, buy sweetamine online at sweetamine.com or call 855-GET-SWEET. That's 855-438-7933, and make sure you use promo code SETH, SETH, to get a nice discount on your purchase.
If you have something like that happen here, like you could just have, each new politician popping up saying, I'm in charge. And, we're not there yet, but that could happen if you have these military age males brought into the military and offered citizenship or some other sort of goodies.
And so with Rome, so basically, if I understand what you're saying here, is that you had your main central army, and then they had the auxiliary armies that were,
Correct.
more in the provinces that were made up of the people working towards earning their citizenship, right? So
Correct.
did they? So okay, so taking a step back, is we also saw that with all these these immigrants flooding across the borders. I forget who it was. One of the high, the political brass, they made an announcement talking about how they were going to allow some of these people to serve in our military, right? They proposed the idea of allowing the illegal immigrants to serve in our military. So that feels like kind of a Rome thing, right? That's happening. So
Percent.
what happened once things started to unravel in Rome? Did you have any instances where, entire regiments or sections of that military, especially the military, of the provincial military, did they turn against the empire? Like, what role did having large chunks of the military comprised of people not actually loyal to Rome itself or the idea it's Rome, only to what the pay they're getting, when things got tough, what happened? What unfolded?
Well, so this goes back to for your listeners, if you really want to understand your world, read more about Rome's crisis of the 3rd century. There's some really great YouTube videos out there on it as well, because this goes back to the 3rd century once again. You have troops were not loyal to the emperor; they were loyal to their general, and that's what starts to happen because they're different tribes and it's whoever pays me, right? And a lot of times generals were the ones paying them. And in the 3rd century, Rome actually breaks up. You have the Central Roman Empire, but then in the West, you have something called the Gallic Empire, which is under a general named Postumus. Him and his troops say, okay, cool, we're going to be an empire. And they last for a good 20 years in the West. Then in the East, you have another empire that breaks off called the Palmyran Empire, which is, I think it's actually a town in Pennsylvania too, but you have the Palmyran Empire under this woman named Zenobia that pops up in the East. So the Roman Empire gets very small. And you have the Roman emperor at that time, his name is Gallienus, who's trying to unite the empire. He's fighting barbarians from the north. He has lost part of his empire in the west. He's lost part of his empire in the east. So you have this very, very unstable thing. And that was one of the major problems, is that soldiers were only loyal to their general. And that is why the 3rd century is just so tumultuous. And then you have Emperor Valerian that comes in after Gallienus, or not Valerian, I'm sorry, Aurelian. Valerian was Gallienus' father. You have Aurelian comes in and reunites the whole thing, and he's actually killed by his troops because they decide, oh gosh, this guy's getting too powerful. And then in 284, you have Diocletian comes in, reunites the whole empire. He actually changes how the military functions because he realizes that, like, okay, these guys have too much loyalty to their general, and that's what's continuing to make this problem happen. Puts in some monetary reforms and things like that. So it was realized that was the problem. And if we have a problem like that here, where we start having troops that are no longer loyal to, whether it's they're the National Guard for Florida or the National Guard for Texas, or, their federal troops, and they start having loyalty to their general or a person, like, we're in real trouble, Seth. And I think that's the road we could be headed down.
That's my concern as well. So the people living at that time, and this will be kind of your best guess or idea to kind of
Sure.
go through a creative process of this. I feel like, okay, in America right now, that a lot of your average people walking the streets of America, they know something is wrong. They know that there's problems with our elections. Like they know there's problems with the medical industry and the mandates and all that kind of stuff. So they know things are off, but they may not have an accurate understanding of how off they really are, because we're always used to what we see, right? So we can't compare life now to life in the turn of the century, 100 years ago, because we become used to all the new norms and all the way life is. But whereas it's almost like if you have you see someone that has a kid that's 3 years old, you go back 6 months later and you're like, oh my gosh, you got so big, because you can actually take a step away and go look at this again, and you can see the difference. Whereas that 3 year old, whatever age they are, they don't see that difference, right? Because they're within it. So I feel like that a lot of people in America don't actually understand where America is at historically, and that we are at a place where we could see the collapse of this republic. So when you're looking back at Rome, and I know this may be a hard question to answer, but I'd love to see you kind of creatively attack it. For the average citizen of Rome, do you think that they saw the collapse coming? Do you think they believed that Rome could collapse? Or do you think that they were just distracted and not really paying attention or not really aware of it? So how would you look at that versus what we're seeing today?
Well, there's often, people talk about bread and circus, and
Yeah.
I think the problem with that, Seth, is I think some of that is a poor understanding of history, because in different sources they wanted to make different emperors look worse, or whatever they may be. Like, there's a few crazy ones, right? Like, you have Caracalla, you have Commodus, you have Elagabalus, you have these like really crazy guys. But I think if you look at the reforms of Diocletian in 284, that's actually a really good indicator of how people felt. Because one of the major things is people lost faith in their currency, because they were mixing in different metals, they were doing different things. And the major thing that Diocletian did off the bat is he standardized currency, because people did not have faith in the currency. And if you don't have faith in the currency, the economy can collapse. So I think if you want one indicator, that's definitely it. Other than that, like, the power structure for regular people didn't change that much. Even when, if you look at the last 100 years of Rome, there were emperors in place, but they were actually run by barbarian kings. And eventually in 476, you have the barbarian king Odoacer says, okay, we're just going to do away with this idea of there's an emperor, and like, yeah, I'm in charge. So the power structure didn't really change. But if you want to look at how people looked at the currency, I think that's your indicator that something was wrong, because people were not willing to use it to trade for different things. They would try to use different things to trade. And that becomes a real problem, because if there's no currency in circulation, well, then, the empire can't control what's happening. And to me, if you want a real feeling, you look at how people treat money. And I think that's a big thing of how, if you look at how it is now. You'd have to correct me on the numbers on this, because it's been a couple days since I looked, but I think, Bitcoin was over $70,000 for a single Bitcoin. So if you want to look at how people feel about the economy, look at things that aren't our regular money and how they're doing. And that's what happened in late Rome, is people lost total faith in the currency. And that's when, as I said, Diocletian realized he needed to do something about the currency and actually minted new coins. But to me, if you look at that, that's an indicator of how people feel about the environment.
It's such a good point. I mean, currency, it underlies everything. I mean, one of my favorite guests is Martin Armstrong, and a lot of his programs are built off looking at what currencies can tell you about life at that time. And I'd say that, especially for folks who are watching this show, there's very little faith in the dollar or the
Yeah.
fern, right? The Federal Reserve note itself. So that's important. I think it's important to look at. But in terms of the actual collapse of Rome, right? A lot of people, they talk about the collapse of Rome, and maybe we have these ideas. Okay, what is the collapse of Rome? It's like the one day that Rome fell. It's the one day all the riots started and the government got thrown out and the barbarians came in. But I think it's much more gradual than that.
Yes,
But
it is.
so what does the actual collapse of Rome look like? And in its most collapsed state, what did it look like when it kind of hit rock bottom?
So this is going to be very controversial because, as I said, us history
Good.
people, we like to fight about what we believe and what we don't believe. But you have kind of so Rome, quote unquote, falls in 476, and what had happened for kind of the last 100 years is you have these emperors in place, but they're really just figureheads. They're really just there holding space, and you would have a barbarian king behind them, basically running them and running what was left of the empire. So they wanted to use the power structure because it was already there, right? There's no reason to create something new. And in 476, eventually, I've mentioned his name a few times, but the barbarian king Odoacer says, you know what, I'm not going to run this through a emperor anymore. I'm going to do this myself. I'm the king of the Roman Empire, and that's eventually what happens.
So let me jump in
And
real
if you look,
quick, just to make sure I understand, because I think this is a really important point. So if
yeah,
I understand correctly, what you're saying is that you have this structure, this infrastructure, this org chart that runs the nation. And so what you're saying is that there's definitely a period, you're saying, upwards of 100 years, where even though it looked like on the surface there was regular governance and order, it was actually that order was being used by an enemy, by a barbarian king, to run the country. So most
that's
people
correct.
in Rome would have thought life was still normal. They had no idea that actually that there it was really a shadow government running their country. And to me,
That's
like, that
correct.
that right there is America. I mean, if you feel like, oh, the president's in charge, whether it was Reagan or JFK or even the ones you thought were the good ones that were fully independent, they were still massively controlled. And so
Yes.
interesting. So it's almost like they kept it going for as long as they needed it. And as Odoacer, you're talking about here, when they no longer need it, that's when they wiped the chessboard and then rebuilt. So anyway, I'll let you continue, but that's just I find it very interesting.
Well, so then in 476, he comes in and says, we're gonna get rid of the charade. And you guys know I've been in charge, so I'm just in charge. So then Odoacer is basically the king of Italy at that point. And then you have in the east, you have the Roman Emperor Justinian. And Justinian's famous for the law code. He's famous for a lot of he's the last emperor to really rule over a united Roman Empire, because what he actually does is he starts a campaign of trying to take Rome back over. And what ends up happening, Seth, is he destroys what was there. So he destroys the power structure that was there to, quote unquote, save it. And history is often written by the victors. So the scribes around Justinian describe the date of 476. Once again, as I said, this is very controversial, and half your audience will probably tell me I'm crazy. But the scribes that were around Justinian described the 476 date of the fall because, well, Justinian had basically ruined what was left, and they didn't want him to look bad. But it had been, if there's a really, really interesting historian named Dr. Brian Ward Perkins that writes about kind of the end of barbarian Rome. And he likes to postulate that Rome was actually, quite profitable in this period of time. It was doing quite well. And it was only because Justinian came in and ended it to, quote unquote, save it, that Rome falls. And, during that point in time, the city is burned. Many of the inhabitants leave. But from 410 to 476 under barbarian rulership, it was pretty good. The Ostrogoths came in 410 and basically sacked Rome. And, we really, for that last 70 years, we have kind of, as I mentioned, Roman emperors that aren't Roman emperors. They're just kind of people propping them up. And when Justinian comes in to reunite the empire, that's the major thing that kills what's left of it.
Interesting. Interesting. So where do you see that America is at on this timeline? There's a lot of discussion about this. It's almost like, when you say that, is it Osterwhack? What's the guy's name? The barbarian king?
Odoacer.
Odoacer. Okay, here we go. Odoacer. These are new words for me.
They're fun names, right?
Yeah, they are. They are. Sounds like it's an insult. You Odoacer. It's like, how dare you? So Odoacer basically at a certain point basically said, okay, we're done with the charade. I'm actually in charge. It almost makes me think of, imagine, say, Obama coming out one day and like,
Yeah.
okay, you know what? I'm actually the person running
This is
the country
actually my
right now.
third term.
Exactly. And not only that, but like we're gonna do away with this whole House of Representatives and Congress, and like I'm gonna impose myself as the supreme ruler, right? Because I'm actually the one that's running things here. But where do you see that America is at right now in this timeline versus where Rome was at. Hey, folks, I've got a quick message for you. So I'm sure you've heard a lot of people, myself included, talking about the importance of buying precious metals, gold and silver. But what's really behind that? Is just a thing of, hey, buy this gold, buy this silver, right? Or is there something deeper that we should be looking at? So I recently came across some figures about house prices. So in 1930, the average family home was approximately $4,000. Fast forward to 2023, the average family home is just over $400,000. So you have to ask yourself, why is that? Is it because things have just gotten more expensive? No, it's actually because the dollar has lost 99% of its value since 1930, right? When people talk about the collapse of the dollar or inflation, this is what it means. Now, let's take a look at gold. So in 1930, if you wanted to purchase your home in gold, it would take approximately 200 gold coins. So 200 gold coins would purchase the average family home in 1930, about $4,000. Now, if you, instead of buying a home with that gold or cash, you set those aside, if you set aside $4,000 in cash in 1930, it would be worth $4,000 today. What can you buy with $4,000? Can you buy a family home? No, you can't even buy a crappy used car. But if you set aside $4,000 worth of gold coins in 1930, which is 200 gold coins, 1 ounce coins, that would be worth approximately $400,000 today. And this is the key lesson about precious metals. It's not about getting rich. It's about putting your money into an asset that protects you against inflation and against the destruction of the currency, which is what happens to all fiat currencies, especially now we're in the end days of the dollar. And so that's why it's important, maybe not all of your money, but a portion of your money, a portion of what you have, I highly recommend putting it into precious metals of gold and silver, because what it's doing is it's protecting you. This is an asset that has stood the test of time, not just stood the test of time since the 1930s. We're talking about the rise and fall of civilizations. Gold was used to buy houses back in ancient Rome. It's still around. It's an asset that will forever have its value. So folks, if you want to do this and you need someone you can trust, there's no person I can recommend more than Dr. Kirk Elliott. He's a very good friend of mine. He's a strong Christian patriot, and he's out to really help people to protect their savings and what you've worked for against the destruction of the dollar, not to mention also protecting it against the dangers of central bank digital currencies. So to learn more about this, go to goldwithseth.com or call 720-605-3900. Again, that's goldwithseth.com or 720-605-3900. Both those places will allow you to set up a quick appointment where you can talk to a wealth advisor that will help get you started on this path. Again, goldwithseth.com, 720-605-3900.
So I think the thing you have to point out is I think people want to say history repeats, and I don't think that's 100% true. I think it does rhyme, but I don't think it repeats, because I think we're most similar to Rome's 3rd century. And the 3rd century, we're talking about the 200s. And Rome lasted another 200 years after that, right, till 476. We haven't had, the continual overthrows by a general. Like, that's something that hasn't happened here. But if you want to look at a lot of the issues that we're suffering from, we have crumbling central power, right? We have a country that's trying to assert itself as more of a federalist system than more of a states' rights system. So you do have this kind of central power issue. Another issue we have is the currency issue. Our currency is out of control, and car repairs this year that I had done 7 years ago cost me double for the hourly rate 7 years ago. That's wild. So the money is out of control, and immigration is going wild. And I think another thing to point out as well, and this is, I guess, one of the downsides of Rome, is any time that there's cultural issues, the Roman emperor says, well, let's all go after the Christians again, right? Because we can unify ourselves as kind of a group going after one group. And that's one of the things that, Caligula does. It's one of the things that Nero does. It's one of the things that Diocletian does, is they look at, because in comparison to America, if you look at, we don't really have a unified American culture anymore. And America was always an innately Christian nation. And looking at Rome, they were a polytheistic society. It was different. And it wasn't in the way of we all worship these different gods. Once a year, you were asked to pray to the emperor, and you kind of prayed however you want to pray. But when things weren't going well, they would go after the Christians because it was a wide idea of kind of uniting people under one idea. And I don't think persecuting Christians is a great idea, but I do think if you look at it, we don't have a homogenous American culture. We don't have, that Christian society we used to have. So if you look at it, we have money's out of control, immigration's out of control, central power's out of control, and there's no uniting culture. Well, that's Rome's third century. So if you want to look at that, if we get in the right reform, Seth, like we can actually fix this thing because the Constitution fixes the federal problem, right? Because anything that isn't given to the federal government in the Constitution is given to the states in the 10th Amendment. But then you also look at if we can handle the currency and get back on hard currency. It's going to be a little painful for a while, but if we can get back on hard currency, that's good. And we have to close the borders and get the people out that did not come here legally. There's nothing wrong with immigration. That's how my family got here. It's how a lot of families got here. But if we do not close the borders, we're going to lose everything.
So you think that we can save this nation, which I tend to agree.
I do.
I think that there's a process. I think a lot of bad stuff has to get taken out. Like you have to destroy the bad, which is difficult because there's always collateral damage. So what path do you see forward for that? I mean, do you think that Trump getting back in, having a second term, not having to behave so well as his first term, or he's trying to win over folks for the second term? Do you think that's it? Do you think, I mean, what path forward do you see? Because sometimes it's hard to see that way forward.
Well, I think the path forward is through the system, right? Because I think to say, like, let's blow this thing up and start again is the wrong viewpoint. Like, I think we need to get back to what the Constitution is. And some of those issues I don't know if we can fix because I say the year that the Republic ended is 1913. And that's because you have the Federal Reserve Act that goes through, you have the Income Tax Amendment that goes through, and you have the 17th Amendment that takes representation away from state legislatures. That's a big thing that needs to be fixed, that we're no longer a functional republic. But I think if you look at kind of where we are, I do think Trump with the right reforms can help us. I think he can kind of fix a lot of the situation, but he needs to hire better, right? Like we need to have better people in those cabinet positions. And he's got to stop caring so much about what other people think about him. Because I think to a certain extent, he does like how the media views him. And he does like being a celebrity a bit. The right reforms and not caring what other people think is what's going to fix this thing. But and Seth, it's going to be painful for a little while to get those right reforms in because we've been living off of the future's money for years. So unless we get hard currency in now, we're going to be too far down the road. And we need to do something about immigration. We really do, because it is out of control. And I have to check the stats on this, but the last thing I saw was under 4 years of Trump, it was like 1.7 million people came in. And under 3 years of Biden, we're almost at 9 million people coming across the border, which is insane. So we need to fix that fast. We really do. And I think with the right reforms, it can be done. I don't think we're, kind of too far down the road. But I think another 4 years, we're too far down the road, Seth. I think this is the time it has to be done.
No, I agree. I say that this is the most important election in the history of our country. I mean,
I agree.
It really determines the fate of our country in many, many ways, which makes me concerned that they're going to try something even more aggressive and crazy to make sure that it goes the way they want it to go. But I want to touch on currency again. You mentioned currency just now, and so
Yeah.
what did it look like? So in Rome, when their currency collapsed from the debasement, inflation, et cetera, what that process look like, and what did life look like for people amidst that currency collapse, and how long did it take?
Well, there was also, it's an interesting thing because there was a lot happening at that same time too. Rome had just had a plague, the 160s to the 180s, where they lost 10% of their population. And then they have another plague in the 3rd century and they think it was smallpox. We're not really sure. So you have the population is depleted, right? And then there's also kind of a once in a generation issue with crops. So there's massive crop failures and people don't have faith in the currency. So what you end up seeing is you're seeing a lot more bartering, people refusing to use the currency. And that was one of the major issues why the emperor wanted to do something about the currency, because people weren't using it. And if they're not using that currency, well, that means the central power no longer has control, right? Because then the central power is there to be the kind of thing between people. And once they take that out, that's a problem. So when you look at it, that was the major thing that was happening is it was more bartering. It was more people saying, you need this, I need that. And that was why you have a new silver coin that's minted and a new gold coin that's minted in the late third century, because we need to get people having faith in this currency again. And it lasts for a little bit, but I will tell you, after about 310, they go right back to the same policies. And that's one of the things that kind of weakens central power is when you have bad leadership, you can have a reformer that can fix some things, but you're going to have the same problems over and over again. So I think what has to happen is you have to have reform, and then you have to have better leaders in the future, Seth. Like that is what does it. Otherwise, we create the same problems over and over again.
Which is difficult because when they're the ones choosing our leaders, not us. We have this
Yes.
illusion that we choose our leaders. But obviously, what's it mean to be a good leader? It's someone that is loyal to the well-being of the country versus loyal to the well-being of a global government that doesn't want national borders, doesn't want America to exist. I mean, it's tricky. It's really tricky to figure this equation out. I mean, we're really on a knife's edge here.
Well, and they also care so much about their own well-being, which that's similar to how, late empire emperors were. Like if you look at, our politicians, they'll take money from China. They'll take money from these corporations. They'll take money from lobbyists. They'll, commit grievous acts as long as nobody else knows about it. And that's the problem is our politicians should be the best of us, Seth, and they're the worst of us. And I think that's the real problem we have is who do we even trust out there? Because if you want to look at Rome's problems came from poor leadership. You have your early emperors that go until about 96, and you have what's called the five good emperors. And it was unusual to have emperors rule for a long number of years, but the five good emperors, they all rule for an average of 20 years, which is really good. The last one of those is Marcus Aurelius. And what they actually did is they created this weird process of adoption. You could actually adopt adults in the Roman Empire. So they would take the person around them that they thought was most qualified to be the leader, and the emperor would adopt that person. That meant he got his name, his titles, his wealth. And for five emperors, they have all this stability because they actually take the best qualified person and they say he's in charge. And then Marcus Aurelius says, okay, I'm going to name my 16-year-old son Commodus emperor. And that is one of the major things that kills it. Unless we have good leadership, we can fix things for a period of time, but unless we have good leadership, we're not going to fix it forever.
And when Aurelius brought in Commodus, what were some things that happened under Commodus that led to the downfall?
So he was actually more interested in being a gladiator than ruling. And he would do these but he was kind of a wimp as well. So he would shoot animals and things like that, but he would do it from a platform where they couldn't actually hurt him. So he would spend all of this time in gladiatorial fights. And he also raised the grain dole. So he was giving out more free food to the people, doing all these different things. And he wasn't actually interested in ruling the empire. So there's actually he reigns for almost 20 years, but there's several attempts to kill him. The first, they try to poison him, but they give him too much poison in the wine, so he vomits and he doesn't die. Then they have a wrestler actually strangle him to death, and that's how he ends up dying. But he was just so interested in his own vanity and, being looked at as the new Hercules and being a gladiator and not ruling and not, legislating his country. And that was one of the major things. He was one of the few emperors that people would actually shout insults at because they hated him so much. People realized this thing is not doing so well, during his reign. And if you want to look at like what caused Rome to fall, it's his reign. It's what causes the next several hundred years of instability.
Gosh, it's almost like, I mean, if you look at Biden as an example, that now obviously he's not a Herculean gladiator. I mean, he's
Sure.
kind of the opposite. But if you look at the public disdain, it's not just like the ultra MAGA supporters. The average person now is calling this guy names and sees what has happened to this country. And so basically, and how long did Commodus rule for? Like, how long did he inflict damage before he set the course of Rome towards that destruction?
So he jointly ruled. So he jointly ruled with Marcus Aurelius, which is a very unusual thing to happen. And the Marcus Aurelius dies in the year 180, Commodus dies in 192, and you have what's known as the year of five emperors. So there's Commodus, and then four other short-lived emperors, because that's where kind of this idea of central power changes over to whoever can get the military who can rule the country. So he really starts that crumble. So he rules for about a good 12 years on his own, but I'd say he's in power for a good 20, which is very unusual for a boy to be basically named Roman emperor.
Folks, how do you feel? Me, I feel great. And one of the reasons I believe I feel better is because I take Balance of Nature's fruits and veggies in a capsule. They have an amazing story how this product was developed by Dr. Douglas Howard. It's right there on their website. Balance of Nature receives over 1,000 success stories every single month. They have hundreds of thousands of customers who've purchased billions of capsules of their fruits and veggies over the past 20 years. You should check it all out on their website. Their products are gluten-free and non-GMO, and they contain no added sugars or synthetics. I think if you're looking for something to make you feel better naturally, you should definitely give Balance of Nature a try. In fact, order today. Whether you order online or call them direct, you must use the promo code SETH, that's SETH, to get this special offer of 35% off plus $10 off any additional sets, plus free shipping and the money back guarantee. So call them at 800-2468-751 and use discount code SETH, or order online at balanceofnature.com and use discount code SETH to get 35% off.
The first, they try to poison him, but they give him too much poison in the wine, so he vomits and he doesn't die. Then they have a wrestler actually strangle him to death, and that's how he ends up dying. But he was just so interested in his own vanity and, being looked at as the new Hercules and being a gladiator and not ruling and not, legislating his country. And that was one of the major things. He was one of the few emperors that people would actually shout insults at because they hated him so much. People realize this thing is not doing so well, during his reign. And if you want to look at like what caused Rome to fall, it's his reign. It's what, causes the next several hundred years of instability.
Gosh, it's almost like, if you look at Biden as an example, that now obviously he's not a, Herculean gladiator. He's
Sure.
kind of the opposite. But if you look at the public disdain, it's not just like the ultra MAGA supporters. The average person now is calling this guy names and sees what has happened to this country. And so basically, and how long did Commodus rule for? Like, how long did he inflict damage before he set the course of Rome towards that destruction?
So he jointly ruled. So he jointly ruled with Marcus Aurelius, which is a very unusual thing to happen. And the Marcus Aurelius dies in the year 180. Commodus dies in 192, and you have what's known as the year of five emperors. So there's Commodus, and then four other short-lived emperors, because that's where kind of this idea of central power changes over to whoever can get the military who can rule the country. So he really starts that crumble. So he rules for about a good 12 years on his own, but I'd say he's in power for a good 20, which is very unusual for a boy to be basically named Roman emperor.
I see. Okay. That makes sense. And so with America, you mentioned, reforms and changing some of these, very fundamental things happening in our country. It's easy to have these discussions about America collapsing and seeing the end of, America as we know it, but also seeing something new coming in, or there's a lot of different, ideas. I would say that if you look at the corruption of our agencies, the corruption of our government, the corruption of our politicians, the fact that, we're being taxed, almost 50% of everything we do goes to the government in some form. And no one's really raising too many flags about it. Obviously a lot of us are, but the average Americans just go along with it and say, well, the government taxes me. And like, we've come so far. So do you think that, obviously, so let's just say Trump gets in and does 40 years worth of really good reforms. Do you think that all that can do is just set us on the right course? Or, because to me, it's just like, I can't imagine how this country would be fixed in even 20 years, let alone 4 years. Without major fundamental changes to the entire fabric of our country.
Well, and I think this goes back to something that you actually raised on my show. And I think it goes back to, sure, Trump can do what he can do, but the presidency only matters so much. Like, unless we get involved in our families, unless we get involved in a local level, unless we start taking responsibility in our own sphere, it can get better for a couple years, but nothing changes, right? Like we've lost the culture. And unless we start creating new culture, which that means books and movies and different things, and we're seeing that, here and there, but we need people to start saying, I provide for my family. I provide my own food. I'm going to vote for my school board. I'm going to vote for my mayor. You know what? I'm going to run for my school board. Unless those things happen on a local level, Seth, we only give ourselves a couple more years of lifetime with a good president. It has to be a grassroots cultural change in who we are as people. Because even, I don't know if you watched, there was that series, the Yellowstone precursor series. If it was called 18 something. But
Oh,
if
yeah.
if you watch how rough those people were, like you didn't mess with those people. Americans are pushovers now, man. We need to get back to being people that we can depend on ourselves and depend on our neighbor and take care of our own sphere. We've gotten to be too soft. We've lost religion. We've lost spirituality, and we've lost the pillar of society that is us as community. So unless we bring that back, presidential reforms aren't really going to help us that much.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, we need more beards and mustaches. Like, that's gonna help save
Yes.
America, right?
My wife made me cut mine because it got too walrusy, so I'm trying to grow it back.
Oh, I see. Yeah, thankfully, my wife, like, she loves it in whatever state it's in, except if it's too short. If I trim it too
Okay.
short, she's like, it's too short." So, so as we're rounding out, I want to make sure to give a big shout out to your show, because you're not just an expert in different subjects, but you do what I do, right? You have guests, you bring people on. So I'll pull up your YouTube page, which luckily you're still on YouTube. But what pitch us your show. Why would someone watch the Jeremy Ryan Slate show that you put out, which I have to say is very well done, very professional? But what do you do? Why is it important?
So I believed in the words of Andrew Breitbart that politics is downstream from culture. And we really talk about like, what are the cultural issues? What are the things that matter so that you can play the game of life well? What information do you need so that you can take care of your family, so that you can run a business, so that you can do these different things? We talk to business leaders. We talk to politicians. We talk to generals, because I want to help people know not just what the game board of life looks like, but how do you play it well so that you can be more responsible for your sphere. So that's what we do over at my show.
And so then tell us about Command Your Brand, because that's also something that you do, which I'll pull the website up for that,
Yeah,
which
so we
is
started
beyond just the show.
So we started Command Your Brand in 2016 because I'm a big believer that podcasts and new media are the only thing that matters. The podfather Adam Curry himself made the statement that podcasts are the last bastion of free speech. So we help people to get their word out on the right podcasts, have the right conversations, and do things like this, Seth. Talk about what matters so that we can make this place a lot better. So we help clients to appear in the right podcasts. We help them run a campaign over about a year. And that's what we do at Command Your Brand.
Great. And so if folks want to get a hold of you, obviously, commandyourbrand.com. Any other ways that they should be, kind of interacting with you?
So I'm on X the most. I'm at Jeremy Ryan Slate over there, and I'm at Jeremy Ryan Slate on every major platform. My parents named me after an actor, so I use my middle name to be able to get found. So yeah, I'm at Jeremy Ryan Slate everywhere.
Perfect. And any closing comments as we wind up this interview?
Well, I would say this, Seth. I would say yes, a change in presidency will help us, right? Like it definitely will help us put in the right path. But if we're going to see change, if we're going to see things get better, it's up to those of you out there listening to start making your own food, to start taking care of your family, to take care of your neighbor. How many people actually stop because they see somebody on the side of the road that needs help on their car? Like, be that person. We need community back, and that is how we save this country.
It's such a good point. I interviewed David Martin recently, and one of his really important things on how to save the country was invite friends over for dinner. Just
Yes.
have your neighbor over, have a friend over, start building community again, which is it's so important. I think it's been lost. I think it's been intentionally lost. Obviously they tried to isolate us and separate us, but yeah, like build local community. It's so
Yeah.
so so critical right now.
Yeah, and it gets on my wife's nerves sometimes because sometimes we're running a little bit late, but I'm like, I see a car on the side of the road. I'm the guy that always pulls over. And I always ask, because people get a little jumpy. I'm like, are you okay? Do you need help? Because you know what? What if that was my wife? What if that was my kids? I'd want somebody to help them. So I think you need to pay it forward like that, even in those small ways. And that's how our community gets better.
Good words to end with. So, Jeremy, thanks again, man. It's great talking to you. Take care and God bless.
So thank you for having me, Seth.
Of course. Folks, I have a quick message for you. Look, the 2024 election is do or die for the globalists and communists that have infiltrated our country and are currently running it. And they either have to win or they're going to destroy America so nothing is left either way. And if you're the person that's watching this show and following this information, unfortunately, you have the weight on your shoulders of making sure that your family is prepared, especially as we head into this next year and this next election cycle, because unfortunately, I think it's going to get rough. And one of the ways I know they're going to target us is through our food supply. You can see all the food factories burned down. You can see the warnings of coming famines and food shortages and everything like that. And food is one of the number one ways totalitarian regimes have always used to control the population is destroy the food supply. So if you don't have at least 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months worth of stored food, I highly recommend you take that very seriously because look, as I mentioned, if you're the person that's watching this, you're the person that carries the burden of making sure your family is prepared. I would recommend at least 6 months, if not a year, of storable food. So if things go haywire, whether it's grid down or terrorist attack from what's coming across the border, that your family can safely stay in place and you can feed your family. So, folks, today, go to heavensharvest.com and make sure you get your storable food that'll last for up to 25 years. Just in case things go south, you know that you have what's going to take to feed your family, which is so, so critical for us to get through this next stage of history. So go to heavensharvest.com today, order your food that'll last up to 25 years, and use promo code Seth to save 15% on your entire order. Again, that's heavensharvest.com and use promo code Seth, SETH, to save 15% on your entire order.